Please join me in welcoming Dr. Silins to the podium for her presentation, Making a Difference, the Value of Lived Experience Research in Understanding and Responding. Dr. Silins.
I'm looking for the creepy guy upstairs from this morning. I don't see him. I'm really excited to be up here, standing up here today, and obviously a little bit overwhelmed as well. Like many of you, this is my first talk in person in 3 years. And like many of you, I'm very happy that we're all here together in person. I'm also very happy we're in person because I'm quite sure I would not be able to fit all of you onto my screen at home for Zoom. That's my icebreaker joke. Last year, I attended the CIMVHR Virtual Forum, and I gave a presentation on the impacts of sexual misconduct from the perspective of those with lived experience. And I'm really happy that that study and the contributions of our participants are being recognized here today, and that I have the opportunity to share what we've learned with all of you. Before coming here, I had a quick look on the CIMVHR website and realized I was the 10th person to be awarded with the Sir Major Frederick Banting Award. But this is the first qualitative study to receive the award. And I think that that's worth noting because I believe that the value of that study is directly tied to this methodology. So when I was reflecting on what to focus on today, I was thinking that it might be worthwhile to highlight how qualitative research, and particularly with regards to the lived experience, provided the incredibly rich, rigorous, and meaningful findings of our study. Before I begin, I just want to acknowledge that this is a very sensitive research topic, but I won't be sharing any details today of sexual violence or sexual harassment, in case anyone was worried about that. So let's begin. I just realized I didn't do my disclosures. I have no bias. No bias. Those are my references for the speed readers in the crowd. There we go. So for those of you that aren't familiar, the goal of lived experience research is to examine the ways in which individuals perceive and experience phenomena, events, and the world around them. And what sets it apart from other types of qualitative research is that it centers the knowledge and the experiences of those with direct, firsthand involvement of these events, or those who have been directly impacted by them. To do this, we generally use one-on-one, semi-structured interviews that give participants an opportunity to share their perspectives in their own words. And researchers then ask what, how, and why questions to better understand the issue and the contexts and environments in which they take place. When I explain qualitative research, some people are very quick to point out that it's limited because it relies on individual introspection, subjective introspection, and it can't be generalized to large populations. And that's absolutely true. Qualitative samples are often small, they are always narrowly defined, and the purpose is never to generalize to a large population of individuals, nor can you make statements about causal relationships or test inferences or generate effect sizes. In fact, every individual interview is unique because every individual experience is also unique. But within these narratives, there are elements of commonality. And as the quote here suggests, these elements contribute to a shared experience, and we can learn from these shared experiences. The shared experiences are often reflected in recurring patterns of behavior or in the expression of thoughts or feelings. I need a sip of water, because there are a lot of you out here. So there's also a deliberate recognition in the qualitative tradition that the researcher's interpretation of the data, so the identification and representation of these patterns and commonalities, is also fundamentally subjective. So how can we ensure that it's good science? Well, like all good science, we make sure to apply systematic and scientific standards to our work, and these standards ensure that the work is rigorous. In quantitative analyses, we assess rigor against various measures of reliability and validity. In qualitative research, we assess rigor against various measures of trustworthiness. And there is fierce debate about what criteria are required or necessary to demonstrate trustworthiness in qualitative research. But just for the sake of brevity, I've listed 4 of the more commonly referenced criteria here. Do not worry, I am not going to turn this into a research methodology talk today, but I did want to just take a moment to emphasize that good qualitative research is anchored in systematic and rigorous methods. So if you'd like to know more about this, I encourage you to reach out to your friendly neighborhood qualitative researcher and ask them about it. So now that we've done the crash course on research methodology, I'd like to spend the rest of my time talking about the value of this type of research, specifically as it relates to sexual misconduct in the Canadian Armed Forces. So this study followed the release of the first independent review into sexual misconduct, otherwise known as the Deschamps Report. Part of the institutional response was to create a comprehensive program of research to better understand the scope of the issue and to improve support for those impacted. This was a comprehensive multi-year research program that involved numerous studies investigating prevalence of sexual misconduct and inappropriate behavior, CAF member and leadership attitudes, bystander behavior, and many other topics. The objective of this particular study was to identify the best practices and barriers for those seeking and receiving support following an incident of sexual misconduct. Now, there's an acronym in the military called BLUF. For those of you that are not aware, it is bottom line up front. It's basically the military's version of the spoiler alert. The bluff in this case is that when we spoke to individuals about their experiences, the accounts they provided us with were much more broad than we anticipated. We went in thinking that we were going to talk about specific support services, and in the process, we heard about what it really means for someone in uniform to be impacted by sexual misconduct. These interviews were often testimonies of entire careers, and they were intrinsically tied to their views of CAF culture and their military identity. We heard about the various ways they were impacted, and as previously mentioned, how institutional responses can help, but how they can also create additional harm. And so these are some of the findings that I'll be sharing with you today. We collected our data via one-on-one semi-structured interviews. The target sample included acting and retired CAF members who had experienced an incident of sexual misconduct. We invited men and women of all ranks and from any region across Canada. Our recruitment strategy involved advertising through a number of internal D&D and CAF websites and social media pages, as well as engaging external stakeholders who had been working with CAF members and veterans. The data collection strategy was built to reflect a trauma-informed approach. In simple terms, this means that we recognized, considered, and tried to support the various ways that trauma might affect or be expressed by our research participants. This includes taking steps such as reviewing our documents for potentially harmful language, offering flexible interview locations to allow participants to feel comfortable and safe, so on base, off base, or by telephone, providing plenty of information about the types of questions that we would be asking about and those we would not be asking about. So for instance, we did not ask our participants to provide us with details about the sexual misconduct that they had suffered. And just checking in throughout the interview to make sure that people were comfortable with the content and the pace of the discussions. We did these things to build trust with our participants and to minimize any potential harm that could emerge because of the sensitive nature of the study, but it also creates the environment necessary to facilitate open and honest conversations, which are necessary for collecting trustworthy data. The analysis we used was a type of thematic analysis called template analysis. It allows us to apply a priori, like broad a priori categories that we knew we needed to look at, but it also allows flexibility so that we can code any emerging and nuanced themes. And finally, we recorded the processes that supported the trustworthiness of the data. Some examples are listed here. Feel free to track me down if you'd like to know more about that process. We ended up interviewing 67 participants between January and June 2018. That's actually quite a bit. 56 of those were interviewed in person and 11 were interviewed by phone. The face-to-face interviews took place in 19 cities across 8 provinces. You can see the locations on the map, they're in red. Our sample was mostly women, but we did interview 8 men. Almost 3/4 were Reg Force, and almost 2/3 were still serving at the time of the interview, although some were in transition. We had wide ranges in terms of age and years served, including young CAF members who were just basically out of basic training, and CAF members who had several decades of service under their belts. We also heard from all rank groups, but almost half of our sample were junior non-commissioned members at the time of the interview. But these demographic characteristics are more than just variables. They often contextualize somebody's experience. So whether they are a reservist, or a junior non-commissioned member, or a woman, or a man. And as I mentioned earlier, the main objective of the study, the original one, was to identify barriers to institutional support. So these are some of the more common sources of support that our participants navigated in the aftermath of sexual misconduct. These points are not exhaustive, but they represent some of the more common issues our participants reported when requiring health or mental health care, when navigating investigative or judicial services, or in their day-to-day work environment, which, by the way, was a context that every single participant discussed with us to some degree, and some discussed in great detail. Findings like these were informative, especially when identifying particular barriers for specific services or contexts. But what we learned from these interviews was that many participants sought support in many contexts, and many participants were met with challenges within each of these contexts. And when we examine these barriers in a more holistic manner, we get a more nuanced picture of what it means for someone to experience these challenges over time. And if we were to try and capture what this more holistic picture looks like, well, it might look something like this. Again, these examples are not exhaustive, but the point here is to demonstrate the higher order that emerges when looking at patterns across individual challenges. Let's see if this works. Yes. If you look at the box in the top right-hand corner, you'll see examples of challenges that participants faced that reflect a lack of transparency across institutional responses. If you look at the bottom left, you'll see examples of commonly reported complaints about bias throughout CAF responses or a lack of impartiality. If you look on the bottom right, you'll see that many participants highlighted the unfair burden that victims and survivors faced after sexual misconduct, which was often contrasted with a lack of perceived accountability and consequences for their perpetrators. And finally, you'll see that the top left corner refers to trust. We found that people lost trust when experiencing multiple barriers over time, but also through the stories they heard about others who were experiencing these same negative events. And when you consider the combinations of these challenges I just outlined, it becomes clear how collectively these experiences impact perceptions of the CAF response to sexual misconduct more broadly. And that's reflected very succinctly in the quote here on the screen. It says, I don't have my glasses on either. It says, given my experience, I would never tell anyone to come forward, ever. Knowing the breadth of these challenges also helps us to understand more clearly the impacts of sexual misconduct. During the interviews, all of our participants described how their experiences impacted them, and it became clear that military sexual misconduct, like all forms of sexual violence, impacts their lives in numerous ways. This graphic represents the different types of impacts that we heard about during these conversations. It's fair to say that many of our participants were impacted in every facet of their lives. And many of these impacts emerged as a direct result of the sexual misconduct event or events, but we also noted that these impacts often emerged or were exacerbated in the aftermath of these events, particularly in the context of the institutional response and the challenges I just described a minute ago, and we call this secondary harm. So I'd like to take just a moment to illustrate 3 ways this secondary harm manifested in our interviews. More reading. First, we found that insufficient institutional responses can worsen or create additional trauma for affected persons. So examples in which we saw this included when participants couldn't access specialized mental health treatment for military sexual trauma, when participants were subjected to insensitive questioning from CAF representatives, or when service providers seemed to lack the proper training for providing trauma-informed care. Many participants also reported experiencing secondary trauma in the workplace. In some cases, participants were harassed or bullied by their peers or chain of command for coming forward. And the quote on the left is one example of this. Oh no. The participant said, no. Sorry, I'm not supposed to touch the mic, but I'm touching it. And while I was there, I just thought of supervisor mocking me and like, why am I doing this? I don't even want to go back to the unit. I just wanted to die. And because the military can be very insulated, many of our participants were traumatized by the threat of coming face to face with their perpetrators. This was the case for the participant on the right, whose job brought her in direct contact with her perpetrator on several occasions. She said, "I've asked to be posted off this base, and they're, nope, no money in the budget." And I'm like, "You know what's going on, right?" And they're like, "Yeah, but there's no money in the budget. So I'm forced every day on the base with my attacker. That's why I put in for JPSU and why I only work 3 days a week." As I mentioned earlier, we heard many participants talk about how their careers had been either interrupted or irreparably damaged because of these experiences. For example, those who could not get mental health treatment struggled to perform effectively at work. The quote on the left of the screen is from a woman who was put on temporary category while she waited for her treatment. She said, "I've been on a TCAT for almost 6 months. I've not started my therapy yet because of the lineup. My career is on hold until this happens." And when we spoke, she was actually on her second TCAT, still waiting for therapy, and she was afraid that she was about to be put on a permanent category because of the delay. Other participants noted that their careers suffered when their chain of command wasn't supportive of their recovery. For example, it was quite common for participants to seek accommodations after sexual misconduct because their work environment felt unsafe due to the impacts of sexual trauma, or they were just navigating a complaint, or they were just trying to recover. Many participants reported that they were unable to get these accommodations, or they had to make concessions or sacrifices in order to stay safe. So there's an example of this on the right, where the participant asked to defer her exams because she had to testify in court against her attacker. She said, "It was my second year, second term. You're going to court Monday. So we were told, you will write all your exams the Saturday and Sunday before. All 6 exams you'll write that weekend and be in court on Monday. I wrote the exams Saturday, Sunday, all 6 of them. I failed academically." Sadly, some of the participants we spoke with had either released from the military because of their experiences or were in the process of releasing. Several participants talked about how they felt betrayed or abandoned by the institution and how this created a lack of trust. Others talked about how they no longer felt aligned with or connected to their peers. Some said the military had changed and they no longer felt like they had a place within the institution. And this was really painful for all of these participants. Both of these quotes are from women who released because of what happened to them. Both of these women had wanted to serve, but had endured several challenges after they reported their sexual misconduct. The participant on the left said, "I believed in it. I was so proud, and then it just got destroyed. Because this uniform, I was ashamed of it." And the other participant said, "It changed my view of the Canadian Armed Forces. I'm being triggered by the fact that I see uniforms, and I'm like, I don't believe them anymore. I don't like them anymore. I don't like the culture." And I just want to point out how they both refer to the uniform here. So again, their negative experiences actually changed the way they saw the entire institution, including anything that represented or even just symbolized the military. And for some, this actually included rejecting their veteran identity as well. So many of our participants told us that they volunteered for this study because they wanted to make a difference. They didn't want other CAF members to face the same challenges or the same negative impacts that they had been subjected to. So the suggestions that you see here are a summary of the things that participants either said made a difference for them or would have made a difference. And there's a lot here. Some of the points might sound straightforward, and some of them are incredibly complex. But just as each challenge and barrier contributes to an overall negative experience, each action taken to address these issues will help prevent and repair harm, especially the secondary harm that I just described. And meeting these needs would also address those higher order perceptions of institutional response that I talked about earlier. So helping to rebuild institutional trust, helping improve perceptions of transparency and impartiality in various organizational responses, and helping to restore perceptions of equity and fairness among those who are harmed by sexual misconduct, either directly or indirectly. I chose a quote here that I thought illustrated a few of these higher order impacts. What I would have liked to this day is something done after my complaint, a debrief, or a feedback, or just the option of knowing, okay, this is what we did. This is how we handled it. What would you like to do moving forward? I want to end by sharing some quotes that illustrate the significant impacts of an effective institutional response. Because we did interview a few participants who reported having good overall experiences. And while this was a small minority of our sample, these interviews were so important for our study because they revealed just how powerful that supportive response can be. And while the overwhelming majority of our participants faced several challenges seeking support, the good news is that most of them also had at least one positive experience with a CAF representative or someone in their chain of command. And these experiences mattered, and so I wanted to share a few of them here. The first quote talks about the investigators who handled the participant's case. She said, "I have the most amazing NIS people. I kept saying at the time that I didn't remember the perpetrator's name, and I said, it really bothers me that I can't place his face or his name. And he said, it's a normal victim response, and it doesn't mean anything is wrong with you. I said, I know all that, but it sure is nice to hear it back." The second quote is from a CAF member who suffered some pretty significant trauma and was facing a medical release. Despite everything he had been through, he was hopeful. He said, "I feel like I have a future, and I can get schooling and benefits. And a lot of that is the Sexual Misconduct Response Center, the NIS, and the JPSU." The last quote is a young CAF member who was well supported in every context: healthcare, investigative and judicial services, and by his chain of command and his peers in the workplace. It was a really great interview. He said, "I really, really like being in the military. I'm really happy because of my current work situation. I am able to stay in the military and contribute effectively in spite of everything that's happened to me." So as I finish up today, I want to emphasize how this research has made a significant difference in academic and applied contexts. First, it has provided us with some very important scientific contributions through the generation of these nuanced and detailed findings. Most of the published literature uses very large data sets, examining the prevalence of various health and mental health outcomes or occupational outcomes. But there's very little published data examining these impacts in detail, and there's very little focusing on institutional betrayal and secondary harm. These findings also provide nuanced information about how to improve organizational responses for those impacted by sexual misconduct. In fact, those of us who work to bring about these changes, having this deeper understanding allows us to be better advocates as we develop these improvements to policies and programs. And I've listed a few such initiatives here that this research has been able to inform. And finally, when done well, this type of research can also help participants by validating their experiences and reinforcing the significance of their knowledge and their expertise and perspectives. So this study provided us with more information than we know what to do with, but there is so much more that can and should follow. So for instance, future studies should explore the experiences of specific subgroups who may have particular challenges and needs. Our study wasn't appropriate to dig down in this way, but we can't disregard the relevance of personal identities and their intersections. Secondly, we did our best to emphasize the relevance of the holistic experience, but there's more we can do to move beyond a cross-sectional design. So for example, examining these experiences through a socio-ecological lens to better capture group dynamics and CAF culture, or designing longitudinal studies to better capture the chronology of these experiences. Thirdly, program evaluation and implementation research can help test some of our findings as interventions are developed, and triangulating with quantitative methods will provide us with a wider lens and further improve rigor. I'd like to finish by adding that as we continue to see the relevance of lived experience research, we also need to be deliberate in getting better at centering these voices. So the research can be very, very powerful, but it can also create harm if it's not designed within a trauma-informed lens. And the data cannot be the end goal of these activities. In order to be good stewards of this knowledge, the research needs to be tied meaningfully to action. And as a researcher, I think we can do this by building our capacity and expertise in participatory and restorative methods, and that goes for me as well. So thank you very much for coming. Thank you. Thank you. Thanks.